Hello everybody, welcome to Film Studies episode 3. If you're yet to see the first couple of episodes in this series, episode 1 focuses on the framing of the camera, i.e. the shot types and camera angles, and episode 2 goes on to look at the editing of those shot types and angles and camera movements. Here in episode 3 we're going to look at cinematic lighting. And beyond that, we'll be having a look at cinematic sound in episode 4 and the idea of mise en scène and framing in episode 5. If this is of use to you, please consider subscription. It doesn't cost you a thing. And please hit like and the notification bell for those forthcoming episodes. I've opened here with Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, a painting from 1942. And it shows here a diner late at night and the directionality of artificial lighting. It makes me think of the cinematic noir genre, Humphrey Bogart in A Trilby, the PI being haloed by backlighting. And if you'll indulge me just briefly, I'd like to have a look at a few of Edward Hopper's paintings, which in their graphical style aren't usually my cup of tea, but I like his work because there's something intangible that I can't put into words on it. What I think this selection here shares is its focus on the directionality of light. And as I take you through these examples, Gustav Deutsch, I think his name is, I might be getting that wrong, a Viennese architect and filmmaker, has actually created a short film of 13 vignettes inspired by Hopper's paintings, recreating them. And in taking you through these and looking at this concept of the artist paying heed to the direction of light, that brings us to the much earlier painter Rembrandt and looking at the concept of the three light setup of contemporary cinematic lighting. So from these Hopper paintings, take heed that in our cinematic filming we must always be paying attention to the source of the light. In this diagram of a cinematic three light setup, we have our key light, fill light and backlight. I want to take you through this so that you as A-level students are able to analyse it in any of the examined films that you are going to do written analysis on. But I also want to give the health warning of not freaking you out with the idea that you need this kind of lighting setup for your practical production. You don't. What I do want to do at this point is focus on the key light. The key light is called that because it's our main light source, and I want you to think of it as the sun. Whether you've got an artificial light like this or whether you are outside just using the sun, hopefully on an overcast cloudy day so that you've got natural diffusion, you are thinking of this as your sun at 45 degrees to your subject or character. When I'm talking about a key light and diffusion with overcast day, I mean that we are looking for soft lighting. We don't want really harsh sunlight casting lots of harsh shadows. The next thing to be thinking about is fill light, or light bouncing back off objects. So I want you to think of this on the right, the fill light, not necessarily as a second source of light at 50%, because you're not likely to be using a three light artificial setup. I don't want to freak you out with that idea. But think of the fill light as a sheet of white card, literally, that you might use to bounce back some of that light. First of all, though, let's keep things simple. One source of light, whether it's artificial or more probably the sun, whether it's the sun and natural light through a window in an interior sequence that you're filming or analysing, or whether you're outside, have that at 45 degrees high angle to your character or subject, and you are making use of Rembrandt lighting. In the lighting of portrait photography, we talk about broad lighting, often a flattering way of taking a photograph of a woman, being where the dominant or predominant side of the face is the lit side because of the way that we are angled to or away from the camera. The opposite, short lighting, would be where the predominant side of the face in the photograph is in shadow. Here, Rembrandt lighting, as it has become known in portrait photography and cinema, is where, like the key light setup diagram that I've just shown you, the key light, the main source of light, or even the one natural source of light, because of being the sun, is at a high angle at 45 degrees from the subject of the painting. And so we have here the highlights on the forehead, the broad light on the cheek facing the light, and the creation on the opposite side, the shadowy side of the face, of a triangle of light underneath the eye beside the nose. We see this again and again in Rembrandt's paintings. And just for good measure, I'm throwing in Vermeer, another artist. Now, you might wonder where I'm going here with this. It's not that I am looking for you to create something that is that classical or that moody. It might seem as though that suits nothing other than a film noir at that point. But if we take high angle 45 degree as our starting point, then we can start to think about how you're going to use this in your productions. This is perhaps a little cringe-worthy for me, but this is me dabbling in some self-portraiture and looking at Rembrandt lighting about a year ago. So we've got here a prime example of this high angle light acting like a source of the likes of the sun at 45 degree from the subject, in this case myself. And through that angling, whereby my body and chest is facing 45 degrees toward the light, and I am turning at something like 20 to 25 degrees toward camera, we're getting this Rembrandt style of broad lighting, the bright side of the face, and the other side of the face forming a triangle of light beneath the opposite eye. This and the next example give you some stark, moody examples of this. These two examples would be a bit more high key. These examples show me starting with something that isn't Rembrandt, short lighting where the predominant side of the face is in shadow and we're turned toward the light, and gradually turning through the light to get more of a Rembrandt style, creating that triangle beneath the eye. To inculcate one final time then, with our one source of light, our main key light or the sun, at 45 degrees, we get this moody effect of the sun creating a broad lit one side of the face and a moodier shadowed side of the face with this triangle of light. If we then combine that with a fill light, or in your case, to keep things simple, a reflective piece of card to reflect or bounce light back, then we get a more balanced approach where we're filling some of that shadowed side in. You may not want some sort of noir, moody shot. You may want something that is more balanced, as in the right hand side of these two, and a more measured or balanced example here in terms of the intensity of light reflected, or if you're using a light source, the percentage power level that you use. So let's start getting to grips with putting this into practice for both your production and your film analysis. High key lighting versus low key lighting. Hard lighting versus diffused lighting. In summary, your source of light might be artificial or, more likely in your case, natural. Your key light is the brightest primary source acting like the sun. Your fill light softens edges of shadows and puts back some detail. What we haven't yet spoken about is the backlight. It shines from behind at a higher angle still and gives the characters what's often known as the hair light. It gives them definition from the background, especially if a more shallow depth of field has been used. Now, I spoke to you in episode 1 about aperture and depth of field. The idea that the wider the aperture opening of the lens, the shallower the depth of field, the background bokeh or shallow focus compared to further planes of focus. I think it's important to understand the mechanics of a lens in that way for your production and analysis, although I do recommend that you have a phone, hopefully on a gimbal, if you can afford to do so, or if school can afford to do so, rather than getting to grips with settings on a camera. But I want to just demonstrate to you here what happens in terms of shallow or deeper depth of field, and a bit later in this episode what happens in terms of exposure against shutter time with aperture settings. When I'm talking to camera in one of my videos, I am consistently using a 50mm lens. A lens in cinema is typically 35mm, a 50mm lens is a bit tighter and emulates the human field of vision. Here I am shooting, I can't remember exactly, but I'm going to guesstimate that I am shooting at around about f5.6. I am pin sharp in terms of my face and hair and glasses, but also looking a bit further back, the shoulders of my jacket are sharp and my ears are sharp, as opposed to a couple of other examples here. I'm guesstimating given the passage of time since shooting, but I would estimate this one to be at something like f4. I'm still sharp, but the tops of my shoulders and the chair behind me are a little bit softer than they were previously. This example is a bit deeper at what I am estimating to be f5 or f5.6. The chair's sharp, so is my head and ears, but quite reasonably, because they're on very different planes of focus, the book in the foreground is softer. However, in this example, which is much more stark because I am leaning close into camera and my shoulders are therefore on a different plane of focus behind, and the chair is on a much further back focus or plane of focus, I think at this stage I was shooting wide open at f1.8, hence this much shallower depth of field. You might wonder why I'm going back over depth of field and aperture at this point. It's because aperture is also pertinent in regard to linking it to your shutter speed settings for exposure overall, which is something that I want to come on to in some of the examples a little bit later in this episode. Hello everyone, hopefully this is picking me up in sharp focus, but I would forgive my camera if it wasn't, because I'm deliberately coming to you in a situation where my lighting and my exposure is deliberately inappropriate. Here I've got no artificial light whatsoever, and I wanted to demonstrate to you today a basic setup of how the 3-light setup in cinema works. Now, rest assured, I am not suggesting that you need artificial lighting setups for your film production, not at all. Get out with some natural light, use a window, use a piece of white card as a reflector, at the very most. At the moment in this room, I am always recording from this office space. It's quite small, it's brightly painted white, and I normally have the blind down with one light at a fairly front-on or 45-degree angle at a reasonably high angle, but not extremely high angle. Today, however, I've got nothing on whatsoever, and I have put my reflector with its black absorption layer up against the window to try to block as much of that out, not all of it because I can't manage it. So, in this scenario, with one light, if I switch on what would effectively at 45 degrees over here be my key light, and let the camera adjust to that, we would get this. Now, if I hit cold, we're currently on a cooler blue temperature setting. If I hit white, hopefully that gives you something, the colour temperature of which looks right. At the moment I've got the colour temperature on my camera, the white balance set to auto. If I hit warm on my light, we should get much more of a yellow tint. If I go back to white, it should be more white. If I go to cold, we should get something of a blue hue. Typically, for this kind of thing, I stick to white. And at the moment, this light, it's only a cheap rig up. It's an entry-level kit. It's not particularly expensive. It's not therefore that powerful. I've currently got this one set to 100% brightness, but I can reduce it all the way down to 20% or a mid 50% level and various points in between. If we assume that the key light is set at 100%, we would hope for our fill light at roughly 45 degrees or 70 to 50 degrees in the other direction. My key light's over here at 100%. I haven't lit a fill light yet, but it's going to come from over here at something like 50%. Now, I've got 3 lights set up here, and I've got a remote control. In fact, I've got 3 remote controls to control all 3 separately. But unfortunately, in this tiny room, using the plonker for one affects all 3 at the same time. So I'm going to have to show you this individually. If I now turn off my key light, my main light, and physically turn it off at this side, from over here I want to put my fill light on, but unfortunately it is going to default to 100% to begin with, and it's currently set to warm. So if I hit white and I reduce this to 50%, and possibly, because it's a little bit high angle at the moment, reduce it down some, then you might find that you have got something perhaps at 20% that is filling in. Equally, if I get rid of that and I go to what is effectively going to act as my backlight, this is further back, it's to the side. I would like it to be further back, but unfortunately I haven't got the room in this room. This, at nothing like that intensity, if we also turn it white and reduce it to 20%, effectively creates the hairlight background separation between subject and background. 100% would be too intense. If I put that down to 20%, you get, at least from the chair, a bit more of an idea of that. Perhaps if I didn't have the chair there and it were just me, you would see something of a little bit of a highlight around the hair. In fact, that's possibly working better without that than the others. So, to put those together, unfortunately, I can't, in this confined space, demonstrate the different levels to you for individual lights. But if I turn this to white, there you have what is effectively the key light, lighting one side of the face, followed by the fill light, which should be filling in the other. Now, as it currently stands with that, I've got them set to 2 different colour temperatures. So the key light over here is white, and currently I've got the fill light at warm. If I set both of them to white, they'll even up, and you'll see that the key light is filling in brightly. I'm just going to jump in and correct myself here, guys, because ironically, within the confines of my small office, as I've crouched down closer or away from the chair and closer to camera, what I'm talking about here as my fill light is actually physically closer to my face than what I'd originally set up as the key light. And so ideally the left hand side of my face should be brighter because that's the key light in this case, in this setup, but at the moment my fill light is the brighter on my right hand side, just so that clarifies that for you. Whereas the fill light should be at a lower level, but unfortunately I can't demonstrate that to you in the close confines of this space. Equally, if I then go on to include a fill light, which is also initially defaulting to a warm light, you end up with this at 50%, 100%, 20%. Now, you're not going to have a light setup even at this level, so don't worry too much about that. The reason that I'm demonstrating it to you is for your understanding of it, but also because it will be useful to you in terms of your analysis of any of the films in any of the exams. Let's just take a look at how we might use something more like one light or natural light for your recordings. Right now I've taken the unusual step of having no lighting whatsoever. And what's even more unusual is that I normally have the blind down in this room, but today I've put my black absorption reflector board in the window as well to try to reduce it still further. Just to show you an example of how you might utilise natural light, if I bring that reflector down to the extent that I can, and get it out of the way for a moment. You'll now see the extent to which that light from where the black reflector was being blocked is now coming in, and even with a relatively translucent blind down, it's still the most powerful light in the scene. If I bring in what was my key light, at white and 100%, that's likely evening it up. Before, over there, was my lighter side. Now, this side is very much my lighter side, and this one is comparatively more in shadow. So now, with my key light still set on 100%, I have, instead of having a blackout to the window at the side of me, I've put the white reflector there, so that this can bounce back some of the light from over here and even up the exposure. It might be that you seek to do that like this, so that you are reflecting more of the light, creating something like the butterfly light of a film noir. Or it might be that you choose to do that with a light itself. But I'm not saying that you need something like this, just a piece of white card, so that you are able to utilise the natural light from a window will be really helpful for your kind of production. Unless of course you're outside and using natural light anyway, at which point you may want to make sure that your natural light is diffused. I'm just unwrapping this to show you that something diffusing light, like a cloudy day, perfect, will get you the kind of results that you want. You don't want to be in really direct sunlight that's really harsh and casting shadows all over the place. So in a similar way, a fill light and a reflector are doing a very similar job, and if you're without a fill light or any light at all, use a reflective surface. In this case, not that I'm encouraging you to do something this cliched, but if I place a light underneath me, I can go on to create something that has a quite ghoulish effect, whether you go for white or warm or a much more blue colour temperature for something that has more of a horror connotation to it. I mentioned the term butterfly lighting earlier on. This is an example of Lauren Bacall being butterfly lit, where the key light from above is the most intense light, but there's also one coming from underneath, a bit like I demonstrated with the reflector, that's creating that shadow under the nose. In this case, it's supposed to be a 20s, 30s, 40s glamour shot, not the kind of ghoulish thing that I've just demonstrated, but similar things could be done to both ends. Now, for the sake of demonstrating this, my framing is pretty poor, you can't see half of me, but never mind. If I wanted, in a situation like you, to use a key light but let's just have it be some natural light. I'm using my key light and I'm setting it to white 100% just for the sake of showing this. Ideally, I'd rather that I was using some natural light and reflecting it, but if I take the black absorption down from the window currently, you're not going to be able to see this. Let me just set that to something relatively low at 20%. You may want to take something else. This is one of the other lights with its diffusion on it that I'm just going to use as a reflective surface. I'd have liked to use the reflector that I've got, but it's absorbing the light to help show this. You can then get a scenario like this where you've got light coming down from this direction onto me. It can be your choice of direction of narrow light. Oh, I've hit the controls now, 20%, and then bring in a reflective surface. If you look under my terrible double chin right now, as I come closer with that, you can see what that is doing likewise to an extent. So that gives you some examples of use of artificial lighting, but I want to take you outside and show you how you might make use of A, what not to do with lighting, and B, when you've got some more appropriate diffused lighting, how you can use the direction of lighting to your advantage. So it's not very likely that you have got studio continuous lighting like I've previously demonstrated, nor is it very likely that you've got any kind of interior studio space. So I've come out to show you what not to do, and right now I'm breaking the cardinal sin. There is direct sunlight really harshly immediately behind the camera. These are not the conditions to be shooting in. It's a blue sky day, there's a little bit of white cloud, the sun is out really harshly. That might sound like glorious weather for a good day out, but it is not filming weather. Ideally, you want to be shooting in at least reasonably overcast or cloudy, roughly speaking, diffused, soft lighting. And earlier this afternoon, I've been hoping for some cloud to come over and demonstrate that to you as we go through this. I want to show you the difference between shooting straight with the light behind us versus positioning your camera work so that you are lighting from the side or backlighting, and how that works differently. Shutter speed. I'm here controlling the camera from my phone at the moment, and I'm shooting, as I always do, at 1/50th of a second. That's the shutter speed that I've chosen. That's what's known as the industry standard for cinematic look. Shooting at 24 frames per second, the rule that you should be sticking to is a shutter speed that is double your frame rate. The frames per second that I'm using now are 24 frames a second. I can't select a shutter speed that is double 24, i.e. 1/48th of a second. The closest I've got is 1/50th of a second. When I talk about an industry standard, that is relating to the proper amount of blur for movement. As I am moving my hands and fingers now, you are seeing a blur. If I was shooting in the wrong shutter speed, that might become more fragmented or jerky, and that's where the shutter speed is incorrect. TV might be shot at different frame rates, but aim for a 50th of a second, or more likely you'll be using your phone. Just to shoehorn in at this point, you are very likely, if you're shooting on your phone, to be picking between HD or 4K. Do as you wish there. You could go down to 720p and be okay, but aim for either 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second for a cinematic look. There is no reason for you to go for 60 frames a second unless you are envisioning making something slow motion, then you need those greater frames per second to be able to slow it down to the extent that you want, but still have a nice detail and not have a herky-jerky effect. That said, if you are going for 60 frames or you are going for 4K, you will end up with huge file sizes and it can become an issue that's not practical in the end. 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second is your quality, and you are looking for a shutter speed that doubles that, roughly a 50th of a second, which to your eyes from maths will look at 1/50. Right now, because it's incredibly bright and I'm doing deliberately the wrong thing by shooting with the direct sunlight immediately behind me, I am operating at f11. If I were to open that up, it would become way overexposed, a bit like this. With my aperture open wider, I am clearly way overexposed. This can be taken further, but just to give you an idea, I'm currently shooting at f5.6 compared to f11 in the last clip, and it's just not appropriate. Of course, your choice of f-stop is chiefly about the depth of field. Previously at f11, the garage, cars, trees behind me were sharp. Now they're soft. If you wanted to maintain the right exposure with a particular f-stop, you would have to change from that 50th of a second shutter speed, which I've recommended because of 24 frames a second. But if need be for your exposure, you may need to make a compromise to 1/250th of a second or some number in the hundreds. They do go up to thousands, although that would only really be for a still shot capturing sharp focus of a piece of wildlife or a bird in flight. But that just gives you a bit more information should you need to make a creative decision or compromise. So at the risk of repeating myself, I just want to inculcate this idea in your minds. Right now, direct harsh sunlight behind the camera directly onto your subject is not the thing to do in natural light. You want to perhaps side light or even backlight, as I'll show in a moment. So I haven't moved, it's the same time, it's the same place, and I am still not arguing that you should be shooting in conditions as harsh as this. This is not the lighting to be doing it, but I want to demonstrate the don'ts as well as the do's. Having moved from the camera being over there with the harsh light directly behind camera shining onto me, it's now shining onto me in profile and we're filming from a side angle. This is still lighting that's far too harsh, but this demonstrates what you can do for something a bit more interesting, whereby one side of my face is brightly lit and the other is in shadow. And you could choose to turn your subject toward the light for what's known as short lighting. Turning away from the light would be broad lighting. Turning into the light, if you were a portrait photographer, is something that's quite flattering to men. Maybe chin up a little bit. Turning away from the light is something that can be quite flattering for female portraiture. In terms of cinema, you might want to think about diffusing your lighting still more, which is what I want to demonstrate next. So I realise on reflection that I actually hadn't demonstrated when I was looking at the reflectors how you would use diffusion. I'm standing in exactly the same spot, actually a couple of weeks on now between not doing it and editing it. And over that way would have been the harsh sunlight onto my face previously, where if I demonstrated the diffuser, I'd have had it out of shot up here between myself and the sun. On this occasion, it's the evening, it's much more overcast, and you get a sense of that kind of natural diffusion anyway. I'll just hit pause there because I'm conscious of the fact that I am talking about things because they're obvious to me that I've not explained. When I'm talking about using a diffuser, I'm talking about softening that light to avoid that contrast of highlight and shadows. I've demonstrated a 3-light studio setup so that you have an understanding of how a 3-light setup in filming for cinema and what it's like. But it's not likely that you're going to have access to that, and nor do you need it. All you need is your mobile phone. That's it. You'll probably be using natural lighting like this, but you'll be avoiding harsh sunlight. You want something more muted and diffused. I want you to have thought about that 3-light setup, A, so that you can be analysing it in film sequences across all of your film studies work, but for the purposes of practical production for your coursework, think about how you can use natural lighting and possibly reflect it. I have a reflector here. You don't need something that fancy, you don't need to buy gear. All you need is a sheet of white card. Go and beg, borrow, steal it from the art teacher in school. If I unfold this, you'll see that mine is absolutely massive. You don't need anything this size. Mine folds down to this size. Actually, something this size without being folded up would be useful to you. This one has a white reflective surface that softly diffuses light. It also has a gold reflective surface to make things look more like sunlight. You also can invert it for a black that diffuses and absorbs, or a more of a silver reflector too. The point I'm making here is that at the moment this side of my face is being really harshly lit and this is in much more stark shadow. If I wanted to even this up using the white, notice what happens here when it's down by my side and you can't see it. What happens now as I bring this up, obviously it's in shot. If I bring it out of shot, you are still probably getting much more of an even light on my face versus this not being here. Harsh sunlight, shadow, white reflector, which may or may not be in shot now, no, or bringing it in so that it is, or if you wanted to do that with a gold for something more like a sunlight, you'd have something like this. So grab something, anything, a piece of white card that has a white reflective surface. You will go from harshly lit one side, shadow on the other, which for a film noir might be just what you're after. I might try and convert this into noir and show you the difference, or bringing up a reflector, obviously not so that it's within your shot, will give you a different style of lighting. Piece of card will do the job. Harshly lit one side, shadow on the other, which for a film noir might be just what you're after. I might try and convert this into noir and show you the difference, or bringing up a reflector. So I've still not moved. I'm on exactly the same spot, but the first example, you were back there and I was facing that way. In the last example, you were over there and I was facing this way. Now I've moved to the exact opposite of the first point. I've also broken the 180-degree rule, but that's for the purposes of showing the behind the scenes of filming. Here, the sun directly behind me is backlighting. It is acting like the studio backlight, sometimes also known as the hairlight, for the reason that you are seeing now, that it is highlighting my hair and probably my shoulders. It's separating me from the background, this halo highlight here on my hair and on my shoulders, in a cinematic way that separates me from background to foreground. It might be still more cinematic if there were a more shallow depth of field. With less bright light I could probably achieve that. We'll have a go at that in a minute. The last example, where I was half lit and half shadow, was acting like the fill light. The first example was acting like too harsh and too front on, a key light. Another film lighting concept that you may come across when you study Hitchcock in particular and the influence of German expressionism on him, or silent cinema, is the concept of chiaroscuro lighting, meaning a bold contrast across the whole composition of the frame between the shadows and highlights, as in these examples from The Third Man, directed by Carol Reed, a 1949 production that was written by Graham Greene. That wraps things up for Film Sound then, everybody. Please tune in next time, and by hitting the notification bell you'll be alerted to tuning in next time for our episode on film sound. Sound is something that's often overlooked in analysis and production, and I want to focus in tomorrow's episode, or the next episode depending on when you're watching this, on how to write academically in an analytical way about the ways that film sound applies to representation and meaning and response. Please hit like if you're enjoying this, and please subscribe for my benefit. Thank you, and see you next time.